CES 2015 brought out the tech heavy hitters.
But which products were the star of the show? Welcome to Vertical Hold, the tech show where we channel surf through the headlines in search of the big picture. I'm Alex Kidman, joined by a man who's been hanging out a bit too long with shady Vegas types and is feeling the worse for wear as a result, Adam Turner. Adam, what's new in tech?
Netflix is reportedly coming to Australia on March 31 after details were leaked at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Pricing is expected to start from $9.99 per month, and Netflix denies that it's going to crack down on Aussies sneaking into the US service.
Flickr's released the data on the most popular consumer cameras used on the popular photo sharing service. In the serious camera space, Canon edges out Nikon, whereas in the smartphone space, it's still pretty much an all Apple show, although there is a Samsung handset in there, which is a new development, because previously it's just been iPhone, 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 iPhone and iPhone.
Mainstream support has ended for Windows 7 Service Pack 1, meaning that Microsoft will no longer push out new features or offer free tech support. Windows updates have also stopped except for security updates, which will continue until January 2020.
Telstra is reportedly upgrading the security on its consumer accounts, adding two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication works with something that you know, typically a password, and something else, some other factor, such as an SMS sent to you. It's a bit fiddly, but it's significantly more secure. So Adam, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but tell us, what caught your eye at CES 2015?
Well, of the things I can speak of, I'd say it would have to be, as usual, the big-ass televisions. The big 21 by 900 inch giants, which cost $100,000 and no one can afford to buy, but they really give you a feel for where they're going in terms of cutting edge technology and picture quality. And,
they're basically there to capture the headlines, yeah?
Pretty much, and to say here's a bigger version of what you will get in your home today or tomorrow. The big thing is that.
Sorry, you mentioned them as big-ass televisions, but in fact they're not. They're also thinner again, aren't they?
Well, they're ridiculously thin. It was interesting. The guy from Sony during his presentation showed off their television, then pulled out his smartphone and held it up and said, "This phone is thicker than that television." So they really are getting down to ridiculously thin levels, which personally I don't care about too much because I'm more interested in picture quality than a fashion statement. But if you're after something that looks good in your lounge room, these curved, televisions that are a few millimeters thick just look gorgeous. They really do.
So it's not just thin, but it's also 4K, although 4K isn't as much of a headline feature as it was last year. It's pretty common, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd say that the resolution wars are pretty much on hold because, even the 2-bit television makers you've never heard of have all now got 4K televisions on their stands. The focus has shifted away from raw pixel count back to picture quality. And of course, that's where you get your ongoing war of words between OLED and LED backlit LCD. In the OLED camp, you've got LG, and it's, everyone has their biases, but you really have to say that OLED is the gold standard these days when it comes to picture quality. It sort of follows in the footsteps of plasma in that it doesn't have a backlight, so it produces perfect blacks, and that allows for amazing contrast, which allows for amazing picture quality. The problem for LG and the other backers of OLED is that it's still expensive. In the other corner, you've got your LCD people with your LED backlights, your Samsungs and your Sonys, and they're getting ridiculously close to the quality of OLED, but cheaper. Samsung's got their new SUHD televisions this year, which is a bit crazy because UHD refers to resolution, but SUHD for them refers to picture quality, like screen technology. So if anything, they're making things a little bit more confusing if they weren't confusing enough. But yeah, the picture quality on that, they've followed Sony's Triluminos with this nanocrystal quantum dot sort of magic technology. Exactly what's going on behind the scenes is anybody's guess, but the result is, again, amazing blacks, amazing contrast, and yeah, if you don't have the top dollar to spend on OLED and you're not a really fussy bastard who stares at every pixel on the screen, then you might find yourself very happy with one of these LEDs from Samsung or Sony. So and it's an ongoing war of words. Each says that points out the shortcomings of the others and tells you all the terrible things about it, and they're very quick. You know, Muhammad Ali would blush at the trash talk coming out of this lot. But so that's
none
the big
of them are actually going to say, "Oh, look, yeah, by the way, this TV, yeah, no, don't talk about that one. That one's a bit rubbish."
No, not of their own, but perhaps of their competition. But what I thought was really interesting is this year they started talking about something called HDR, which they haven't really talked about in televisions before. And if you use a digital camera or a smartphone, you've probably come across HDR. It's high dynamic range. It's the setting on your camera that says, all right, there's a lot of bright and dark things in this photo, and I can't capture that range in one go. So what I'm going to try and do is take a couple of photos and merge them all together so we can see the bright highlights and the dark details in the shadows all at once. On a television, what this means is that they're expanding the range of brightness that the television can show. So we'll say you're watching a vampire movie, there's a graveyard scene, there's a bright full moon in the top corner, and there are monsters lurking in the shadows on the side. On most televisions, it would try and strike a compromise in the middle, and you'd lose some detail in the moon because it was too bright, you lose some detail in the shadows because it was just too dark. And the television would do its best. The better the contrast on your television, the more you would see at both ends, right? High dynamic range takes that another step further again, so you will see more of the details of the moon and more of the details of the monsters in the shadows at the same time in the one picture. Samsung's had this technology for a while, and it's built into their new range. But the interesting thing with Sony and LG is they've actually signed partnerships with Netflix this year. So their top of the line HDR televisions will be Netflix compliant, so they'll have the Netflix app. But Netflix is actually going to stream content like Marco Polo in HDR. So they're going to stream it with that extra contrast details in there. So if you've got one of these HDR televisions, it will look even better. It bumps up, instead of using 15 meg, you're using about 18.
That's interesting in that it brings up the other side of the equation, and it's always been the thing that we've pointed out as the missing part of the 4K equation. It's great that we're getting better picture quality, and honestly, year in, year out, you'd kind of expect that because the technology gets better.
Yeah.
But we've always been lacking in that 4K content to have. Was there a lot of that at CES though? I mean, was there a lot of talk of, right, here comes that flood of 4K content that we've been promising finally?
There was, but it was all online, and very little of it was for Australia. They were talking about their deals with with Netflix, and Netflix is coming to Australia in March. We now know that we'll suspect it's going to be March 31. If you have fast enough internet connection in Australia, you will get Ultra HD from Netflix and a compatible television. If you have a HDR television,
to the 5 people out there who do.
Yes, you bastards. If you have a HDR television, you will get the HDR content from Netflix as well. They're not restricting that just to the US, but if you're in the US, you also get that from Amazon. You'll get it from YouTube. I think there was one other vendor in there as well. As for physical media, the usual online suspects.
Yes,
when it came to physical media, all that we saw was Panasonic had a 4K disc player prototype on their stand that they weren't really sharing a lot of detail about. Sony and Samsung and LG were all very quiet on this. This time last year, Samsung were telling me at CES, we've got a 4K media player coming, will be here by mid-year. This year they're saying, look to the internet, don't look to us. So it looks like that the hard television makers have kind of got a bit of a get-out-of-jail-free card here, is that they can now say, the Netflix has taken the weight off our shoulders now. They're going to do that. And I think they will get there. I'm sure that Panasonic wasn't the only one that had a prototype. I know that other vendors had things hidden behind their stands in private booths for only certain individuals to view, and I saw a little bit of that myself. I didn't see any other 4K media players, but I'm sure if I looked behind enough black curtains, I would have found at least one more. So I think it's a bit of a chicken and an egg, and some of them were telling me off the record, we're watching each other, and as soon as one jumps, the others will follow. But now that Netflix is doing it, I think they're going to hold off a bit longer. Well, Alex, I kind of have a thing for big-ass curves, but CES isn't all about television, so what caught your eye?
Well, there were a few interesting things. Intel had a few announcements to make. They finally actually announced the availability of their Broadwell processors, which should be coming to a whole bunch of largely laptops and a few tablets this year. Broadwell will be cheaper, predictably a little bit faster, but the big thing that they're promising with this is better battery life, and that's really what we want out of all of our mobile gadgets. They also showed off their compute stick, a little HDMI dongle, kind of like the bastard child of a Chromecast and an Apple TV, but running either Windows or Linux for fairly cheap money.
That's a sex tape I'd like to see.
That's a sex tape I have zero interest in seeing now that I've actually brought up that horrible, horrible image. I'm sure the lawyers would be involved with lots of black bars, let's face it.
Yes.
But they had some interesting prototypes and concepts to show off. But what that also highlighted to me was, while CES is a consumer electronics show, and there's a lot of little players and a lot of kind of innovators in it, and predictably also, of course, a few wacky out there products that will probably never come to market. There's also a lot of big players who don't bother turning up to CES at all. Microsoft outside the laptop vendors showing off stuff, virtually invisible. And they've got Windows 10 coming out this year. You'd think, well, maybe they might want to push that to the consumer space. Apple has not been at CES for years, if ever. And I mean, again, that's very, very standard Apple, but I mean, they've got the Apple Watch coming up, and everyone else showing off some kind of smartwatch was invariably being compared to the Apple Watch, and lots of rumours circulating around when we'll actually see that, but they were not there either. They're seemingly happier to focus their big spend and their big push for headlines towards their own controlled events rather than the general chaos of
Apple
CES.
in particular, they're control freaks. They don't want to be part of a bigger show.
Although I did find it funny, at least one person tracked down a no-name Chinese vendor who was selling a fake Apple Watch, which would boot up to that icon screen that Apple's shown off for about 15 seconds and then drop back into being a much more kind of simple feature watch, which I thought was a cool idea for $25, but it's still a fake. It says a lot actually about Apple's position in that market and where they're seen. Those are the things that kind of really jumped out at me, apart from the obvious stuff that you might expect. There was a lot more kind of wearable stuff veering into the VR space, because Oculus had stuff to show off, as well as a lot of smart home stuff. Now, I know you're kind of passionate about smart home, and you got some hands-on time, I think, with a few of the new smart home pieces?
Yeah, the smart home thing was interesting. Belkin extended their range. They're bringing the Wemo, or the Wemo is the name of their range, and they're bringing their Wemo Maker to Australia, and that's the adapter that lets you wire up pretty much any electric device like a motor for a garage door or something and control it remotely. They also expanded their range of lights and added things like door and window sensors, but a lot of other stands that you went to had a very similar range. Samsung is bringing in a range almost identical to the Belkin Wemo gear, and lots of others, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because it's all about ecosystem. I think the All-Seen Alliance is
although there are standards at play here. I mean, or at least theoretically there can be standards.
But the great thing about standards is that you have so many to choose from. A lot of them were putting themselves in Apple's HomeKit camp. A lot of others were joining something called the All-Seen Alliance, which is basically for people who aren't HomeKit, I suppose. It's just an interoperability standard between smart home gear. A lot of the big players in it. I think Samsung might be involved in organising it, but they're not controlling it. The success or failure of that, I think, will be really important to see how that stuff stands up against the Apple gear, because as with all stuff, Apple gear will do less than the competition, but what it does, it will do extremely well. So the competition will really need to get its act together, and it will be standards like this All-Seen Alliance that will sort of help them stand up. Well, that just about wraps it up for this episode of Vertical Hole.
Thanks for joining us, and remember, if you like what you see, hammer that subscribe button.